Good evening. Thanks everyone for coming. We're very excited to talk about how you can leverage partner technical validations to bring your customer differentiated solutions. And this talk is intended for technical audience or AWS partners. You can be a solution architect, a tech lead, or some other IT professionals. Either you're new with AWS Partner Network, or you're in the process or planning to use AWS Partner Technical Validations, this is a very relevant session because we will talk about the 5 most common challenges we have discovered from partner applications. And we'll discuss how to address these gaps to help you mitigate and self-assess so that you can continue to grow and mature your practice and deliver high-quality solutions to your customers. This is a 200-level talk. We do have some well-architected specific areas and some high-level architecture diagrams, but we do not go into in-depth for a particular solution, and there are no coding samples either. My name is Jing. I'm a AWS Global Tech Lead for Service Partner Technical Validation. I'm here with my manager, Mike. Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Deck. I lead the solutions architecture team responsible for all of our technical validation programs within the APN.
Thanks, Mike. Let's get started. Show of hands, how many of you are AWS partners? Great. Seems like a majority, if not all of you, are partners. We hope you walk away with today's session knowing the right technical resources and then best practices to implement for your workload so you can be successfully doing your technical validation. Second question, have you validated your customer solutions with AWS before? Some, okay. For the ones who have done it, thank you. We would love to hear your feedback this week. And if you haven't done it, today's session will help you to get ready to do so. So why do we validate partners? The most important reason is customer obsession. We wanted to reduce the risk associated with AWS customers. We wanted to making sure they got secure configuration of their AWS account. We wanted to making sure customers have the resilient architecture built for that workload. We also want to save time for customers when they're searching for which company to partner up with for their use case so that we know they're in good hands when they choose AWS validated partners and solutions. We often hear customers say that they value the technical expertise by partners who are validated by AWS. And they look for those badges when they're making the buying decisions. And you'll hear more customer data from the keynote on Wednesday from Ruba. So there are 3 reasons AWS customers and AWS sales team choose a validated partner. First and foremost is their technical expertise. They have demonstrated they have deep domain knowledge on AWS services, use case, or workload. That combined with the program benefit of the close engagement with AWS experts, they can deliver time and cost saving solutions to customers. And additionally, they bring customer success to the table so that potential customers know it has been done and it has been done successfully before. So let's hear from a customer. This is a quote from Scott Stockland. Their CIO are talking about they needing help migrating and operating SAP on AWS. We recommended one of our premium tier partners, Lemongrass, for this use case, and they're happy with the recommendation, and then they went forward with the engagement successfully. What about for partners like you? What benefit do you get by going through these programs and technical validations? This is a high-level overview of the list of the benefit you can unlock with the program. You can look for the details by going into Partner Central and search for partner benefit for specialization. Here, I'll highlight a couple of high-level categories. To start with, there are financial incentives you can obtain. You may have heard of Market Development Fund, MDF, and you can gain $5,000 MDF cash for each service delivery designation, or $10,000 per designation for competency. Along with that, there is MAP, Migration Accelerated Program funding, that's eligible with up to 30 designations. And the second thing is recognition. So once you earn this specialization badges or this technical validations, you will be able to obtain that badge and use it for your sales and marketing activities. And you also get priority in the AWS Partner Solution Finder, which is customer-facing discovery tools. With early access and expert engagement, you can get access to the product roadmap, and then the strategic discussion, industry insight, and so on and so forth. And of course, we also have signature benefit that are unique to a particular designation that's on top of the general program benefit of the 4 categories we have talked about. So with that, I wanted to present you one quote from Bellflower. Their president are talking about the program benefit, deep learning, which is now part of Partner Equip, and that, and then the 2 service delivery validation program has helped them close 75% more opportunities compared to the year before. So you can be one of them. So what are the validation criteria? There are 2 things we look for. The first one is, are you following AWS well-architected best practices? Essentially, are you demonstrating technical expertise? Second, do you have a track record of customer success? Because we would like to recommend you to future customers. The first thing they'll ask is, have they done this before for other customers? So those are the 2 things we look for when we do program technical validation. We focus on different specifics when it comes to validating a solution from a software partner or a consulting offer from a service partner. For software product, we look for the solution configuration, technical architecture details, as well as operational processing to handle incident logging and monitoring. For services partner, we look for repeatable mechanisms or SOPs, standard processes, for you to engage with customer. This could include your training and onboarding process and document, your repeatable mechanisms, your security SOP. We'll discuss those details later. So with that, we have talked about why it's valuable for you, why it's valuable for customers. I'll hand it over to Mike to get us started with the 5 challenges we've seen.
Great. Thanks, Jing. So as Jing mentioned, we've done thousands of validations for both software and consulting partners every year. And when we go back and look at the data from those reviews that we do, we see some themes emerge in terms of the most common issues that come up that we work with partners to mitigate as a part of these reviews. And so those are the things that we want to talk to you about today, so that you can go and implement these best practices before you come into our validation programs and make it that much smoother and easier for you. So to get things started, we'll start off talking about basic account security. So as the name implies, these are very fundamental, foundational best practices that are super critical to get right, because if you don't get these right, they can undermine all of the other controls that you have in your environment. So when we think about basic account security, we really think about 3 primary things. First of all, set the contacts for each one of your AWS accounts, secure the root user, and then use tooling to automatically assess the security posture of your AWS environments. So first of all, account contacts. So every single AWS account that you create, the first thing that you have to do is come in and provide an email address to create that account. So that's the root email and contact information. And it's extremely important that that is an email address and phone number that you control, because this is this is involved in the password reset process. So someone that controls the root account email address or the phone number for your account has the ability to go and reset the password and potentially gain access to your account, which is not a particularly good thing. So what you don't want to do is have developers going out creating accounts with their own personal email addresses and not transitioning those over to a corporate email. Make sure that you're using corporate-owned email addresses that you control. So regardless of who comes or leaves your organization, the corporate entity still retains full control of those accounts. Now, in addition to that, every single account also has alternate contacts for billing, operations, and security. Each one of those also has additional contact details, and we use these contacts to send you important information about your account. So it's important that you're monitoring these emails and contact pieces. So you want to make sure, again, that these are corporate email addresses. Ideally, you're using distribution lists that are owned by multiple people so that there's no single point of failure and you're not dropping these kind of notifications on the floor. Again, this is simple, basic stuff, but it's super important that you make sure you're getting this right on all of the different AWS accounts that you own, because it does have pretty significant impacts if you're not doing this. One additional thing to note on the alternate contacts piece, earlier this year, we released a new API in organizations that allows you now to set these programmatically. So if you're managing really large AWS environments that have lots and lots of accounts under a particular organization, you can automate the management of these account contacts instead of having to go in and manually set them. So that's super important if you've got large sets of accounts that you're dealing with. Now, the next piece is securing the root user. Hopefully this is stuff that everyone here is already doing, but I can tell you from our data that there are absolutely people, statistically speaking, who are probably not doing all of these things, which is fine, but I think this is a really, really important thing to make sure you're getting right in every account that you've got. So if you're not aware, every single account that exists in AWS has what's called a root user, which has full permissions to do anything in the entire account. There's no way to limit it. You can't apply an IAM policy. There's nothing you can do to limit the amount of permissions it has. And so it's really important that this particular user not fall into the wrong hands. So the first most important thing when it comes to securing the root user is don't use the root user. You don't need to use it for daily operational purposes. Generally speaking, there's nothing that you need to do on a day-to-day basis that would require you to use the root user. So we recommend that you lock those credentials away and instead use IAM principles. Ideally, you're using something like IAM roles and IAM Identity Center to manage kind of day-to-day operational access to your environment, but don't use the root account for those kind of day-to-day normal expected tasks. Second big thing is enable MFA on the root user. This is actually something where I would say put MFA on everything that you have. Every single time that a user is accessing resources, either in your AWS account or frankly anywhere in your environment, there should be two factors that they're required to use to authenticate. Implementing this alone would have saved countless numbers of customers from really bad days. Like this is a very simple thing that you can do that has a really big impact and absolutely is something that will improve your security posture overall. So making sure that that's on the root account specifically, absolutely critical, and really this is something you should be doing across your entire environment. And then the last piece is deleting access keys. So this is something that a lot of folks sometimes don't think about, but every IAM principle in AWS has both the ability to log into the console via a password and potentially MFA, as well as use access keys for programmatic access. So if you're using something like the CLI or SDKs to script things, you would use access keys to do that. But again, like we've talked about, the root user is not really intended to be used for those types of common operational activities, so you shouldn't be using it to do any kind of automated scripting or access. So generally speaking, you're best off if you just delete those access keys if they exist. By default, they don't exist, so if they don't exist, great, don't create them. But make sure that that's true. Make sure that you've gone in and checked to see that your root account has no access keys assigned to it. So the last sort of step in our basic account security best practices is to assess your AWS accounts with tooling, right? So this is a little bit of, I'm cheating a little bit with this best practice because really this is kind of encompassing a large number of other best practices. So there are dozens of things that we could talk about in terms of network security, VPC configuration, how are your security groups set up, how have you managed IAM policies, et cetera, that are all really important as well, right? But that becomes kind of really overwhelming and kind of unmanageable to go and manually assess all of those different kind of individual best practices within your environment. So we really highly recommend that you use a tool to go and set up automation to do these checks for you. Now there's a number of different tools out there that you can use for this. AWS Security Hub is a native AWS service that you can use and turn on with one click in order to go and start running assessments against your environment. There are also a number of awesome partner options out there that you can purchase on Marketplace and through other avenues that give you really rich functionality to assess your AWS environments as well as other aspects of your IT infrastructure. And then there's also free open source tools that you can use to do all this. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which of these tools you start with. What we want you to do is pick one, pick a standard, and run it in order to start to get a sense of what are the problems that exist in your environment. This will give you a way to get visibility into what are the things that you need to go and address and allow you to start prioritizing that work, understand what needs to get done, and plan all of the fixes that you'll need to do that. So when it comes to how do we assess this kind of basic account security piece within the context of a software product? Well, first of all, when it comes to a SaaS product, what we're looking for is that you have implemented all of these best practices in the accounts that manage customer data. So we want to see that the root account has been secured, that you've got all of your account contacts set, and that you're scanning things with automated tooling. We also ask that you provide a CIS benchmark report. So this is an example of sort of the way that you would use automated tooling. So pretty much all of the tools that I discussed support this. The CIS AWS Foundations benchmark is an industry standard benchmark that's supported by most of these tools. And we use this as a way to easily collect evidence that you've implemented the best practices that we require in our checklists. And so we look at that as a way to determine that all of these pieces are in place. There's also a link here to some additional details about the AWS Foundational Technical Review. So if you've got a software product and you're interested to learn a little bit more about the specific individual items on that checklist, please take a look at that. And I'll hand it back to Jen to talk a little bit about how we look at this from a services partner's perspective. Sorry.
Similar to the validation requirement for software product, we wanted to making sure our service partners have the right security posture when they deliver consulting offers to customers. Like what we discussed before, we are looking for that standard SOP. So in this case, we require our service partner to develop that secure AWS account governance SOP. So the details should include the different element Mike has mentioned in terms of setting the right corporate account information, as well as making sure that you secure your root user. So in this case, we understand not every single one of your customer engagement requires you to create AWS account on behalf of them. But what we're asking here is making sure you have that standard procedure so that you have a consistent way to onboard not only your customers, but also your consultants, so they can deliver that consistent, secure consulting offer to customers. For managed service providers, we have the additional requirement for them to implement a security monitoring dashboard. The good news here is you don't have to reinvent the wheels. We've been talking about AWS has a lot of security best practices. We have a link over here, AWS prescriptive guidance, that has a lot of details, show you how to do this step by step. So strongly recommend you to take a look at this and incorporate this into your security SOP. And the idea is you could use this to visit all your ongoing customer engagement and making sure those AWS accounts set up by your consultants are secure, are following our best practices. As an example, when you're starting out, you could also leverage AWS Control Tower to create landing zone. So with AWS Control Tower, you can provision AWS accounts, leveraging the account factory from AWS Service Catalog. Control Tower can also make use of the APIs of the Service Catalog to further automating, provisioning, and updating of those accounts. So once these accounts are created, a set of preventative guardrails can be set by Control Tower. We could have an example, deny a publicly open S3 bucket, or deny the ability to change the resources provisioned by Control Tower. You can send the cloud trail logs to a dedicated log archive account, or set up AWS config delivery stream to audit account. And you would have a single pane of glass monitoring these account activities and make that visible to multiple teams if necessary. So AWS has launched over 20 new proactive controls in Control Tower to enhance the governance capability, that allowing you to implement controls to remove the non-compliant resources before you even provision them. And you can check out the details with the AWS Control Tower reference guide. At the same time, we highlighted a re:Invent session, COP304, for you to deep dive into Control Tower capability. Second area we've seen partners are challenged with is also security related. It is how you access to customer account. This is a very common scenario for AWS partners. Either your software product need to access a customer S3 bucket, a Lambda function, or your consultant need to work hands-on in customer AWS environment to help them build and develop that workload. And you can add a lot of value by working in customer's AWS account, but how you do it is a way to establish customer trust. The first and foremost important principle is to avoid using static credentials like long-term access keys. IAM access keys can be used by anybody, anywhere, as long as the customer doesn't revoke them. And this is not really ideal situation for either the partner or the customer. So if the customer handing you access keys, you have to making sure that you manage them securely, store them, but instead you could use those time focusing on delivering solution for that customers without worrying about the security aspect of it. So instead, we recommend you to work with customer to issue temporary credentials for you so that you avoid using IAM user and the static credentials. For workload or code access, we recommend IAM roles. There's temporary credentials. For human access, we actually recommend you to work with customer for them to issue an identity to onboard your human consultants into their environment and assume roles and then work in their AWS environment that way. Lastly, when setting up the IAM policies, we recommend you to use least privilege permissions. So that is to say you only grant the necessary permissions to perform the task. So you can start broad when you're setting up with a new workload. As you understand the workload pattern more, you can narrow down and then go for that least privilege permissions. One thing you can utilize is IAM Access Analyzer. It will generate least privilege policies for you based on the access activities. So for the partner validation requirement, very similar to the first one we're talking about, we would like to see everybody define a standard approach to access customer account. This does include making sure your approach is consistent with AWS recommended IAM best practices, avoid using IAM users whenever possible, and have customer issue identity provider to federate your consultants into their environment. And for managed service providers, use a centralized identity provider. So for all of these activities, assessment, you can also look into IAM best practices within AWS resources. We do update this best practices frequently. So if you haven't checked it out for a while, it's a good idea to go in there, again, adopt the critical points over there that consistent with what we're talking about today, have that be part of your standard SOP when accessing into customer account. And that's, again, consistent way to do that with your consultants, with your customer, so you're in customer trust. This is just a visual illustration of what we're talking about here in terms of best practices to access into customer account. So require your human user to use temporary credentials when accessing a customer AWS environment, work with your customers to issue identity provider for your consultants so they got federated access to customer AWS account. We often seen customers adding partner consultants to their Active Directory for single sign-on access. And this way, they can onboard it to the customer environment. We do understand that not every single time your customer will give you this recommended way to access into their account, but we would like for you to act it as trusted technical advisor to guide your customer what's the best way to facilitate into their AWS account. Similarly, we have 3 sessions recommending you for deep dive with anything IAM or security best practice this week happening at re:Invent. So those 3 sessions are worth checking out if you're interested in learning more.
Great, thanks, Jing. So let's talk a little bit about how this applies in a software context. So if you've got a software product, specifically a SaaS solution, that needs to access a customer's AWS account and make API calls there. So let's say that you're building one of those security posture assessment tools that we talked about previously. You're going to need to make calls into your customer's AWS accounts. The way that you collect the credentials necessary to do that is really what we care most about within the context of this theme. So what's important to not do is to ask your customers to provide you with static credentials for all the reasons that Jing talked about. Instead, what we want you to do is use an IAM role. So ask your customers to create an IAM role in their account that trusts yours, and then you can use that role to assume, you can assume that role in your account, create temporary credentials, and use that to go and access any APIs that you need to inside of their account. Also important to note, if you'll notice up there, kind of at the top of this sort of theoretical form that we're showing here, there's an external ID that's shown there too. That's really important for mitigating something called the confused deputy problem. So I don't have time to get into all the nuance of how exactly that works right now, but there's some great documentation. We've got a link on the next page that you can kind of read more about that. But again, this is super important. If you're going to access customer accounts, make sure you're doing it this way, not asking for static credentials. So again, what are we looking for from a software product when it comes to customer account access? Use temporary credentials, use IAM roles, not users and static credentials. Automate as much as possible, and if you can't automate, at least well document the process and the specific permissions and configurations necessary that customers need to give you. What we don't want is for a customer to sort of not understand exactly what permissions are necessary for your product to run, and then go off and create star policies that just grant access to everything. So make sure you're giving them that guidance that they need to do it the right way. As we mentioned, implement external ID correctly. This is something that does have some nuance to it. It's not sort of immediately obvious and clear to a lot of partners how to do this. As I mentioned, we've got a link right there for the documentation on this. The documentation is great. Have a read through that so you can understand exactly how this works. At the end of the day, it's pretty simple to get right once you understand how it works. And then the last piece of this is to deprecate any static credentials that you do have. So we recognize the fact that you may have already onboarded a bunch of customers using static credentials. We're not telling you to go and turn those off immediately. We don't want you to negatively impact existing customers. But what we do want is to say, stop doing that. Make sure any new customers that you have that are coming on board are using the right way, are using IAM roles going forward. So you can still sort of take your time in helping those existing customers migrate off of the static credentials. We just want to make sure that that's been sort of formally deprecated in the product before we sign off on it. All right, great. So moving on to the next topic, resilience. So I think Werner said it best when he says everything fails all the time. So no matter where you're building applications and workloads, you need to take into account the fact that things are going to fail. And resilience is really about building systems that can recover in the case that those underlying components do inevitably fail for you. So quick question for everyone, show of hands. How many folks are aware of the AWS shared responsibility model? How many people have heard of that? OK, great. How many people think that that's only about security? Is everyone aware that this is now sort of something that we talk about in terms of resilience as well? So this was an update that happened about a year ago at this point. We released an updated white paper. Highly recommend you go check that out, that describes how the shared responsibility model kind of applies in the context of resilience as well. So the shared responsibility model defines sort of what are the responsibilities of AWS for providing security and resilience of the cloud, and what are the responsibilities for customers in terms of security and resilience in the cloud. And so what's important to note is, while AWS has lots of engineers that work constantly to try and build the most robust, the most highly available services that we can, when you're building on top of those, there are still things that are on you. There's still responsibilities you have to ensure that you're building resilient and fault-tolerant architectures on top of those services. So this is sort of a joint effort that we work on together in order to kind of provide end-to-end resilient applications for our customers. Now, when it comes to our validation programs and sort of evaluating, have you sort of done the right thing when it comes to resilience, it's a little bit more challenging than it is in the security world. And in security, there's a lot of cases where I can kind of tell you, this is right and this is wrong, right? You know, absolutely, put MFA on root. Like, there's no excuse for not doing that. When it comes to resilience, it's much more about a balance between cost on one side and the sort of availability and recovery characteristics that you need to achieve in order to fulfill your business goals on the other. So what we care about is less about what specific architecture and operational model you've chosen, and more about, are you thinking intentionally about this trade-off? Have you set goals, and have you made choices to sort of intentionally establish the right balance for you and your customers, or are you just sort of building the way you think makes sense without actually thinking about these things or testing them or kind of working through that? So when you start looking at architectures, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way of doing things, right? So this is a super simple architecture. It's a single instance sitting inside of an auto-scaling group that's going to automatically create a new instance in a different availability zone in the event that the first one fails. Very simple, low cost, low complexity, but at the same time, it's not super resilient, right? If an AZ were to fail, or this single instance you had were to fail, it's going to take a few minutes for you to detect that this went down, for the AZ to go and create a new instance to get the application back up and running. So again, if that's the business requirement, that's what your customer needs, that might make sense to go and implement this type of architecture. But on the other hand, you may have customers that need more sophisticated resilience kind of footprint. They may have business needs that require better RTO, better RPO, in which case you can look at architectures like the one that Citrus, who's an AWS Competency partner, built for one of their financial services customers. So in this case, this is a pretty standard architecture, again, where they've got multi-AZ deployment across each one of the tiers of their application. So they're running active instances across 2 different AZs. They've got a multi-AZ RDS database with synchronous replication there. And this provides a much better sort of resilience profile for this application compared to the architecture that we looked at last time. But the trade-off there is that it's going to cost more because you have more resources provisioned, and it's a more complex system to reason about. It's a more complex system to operate. But again, if that's what your business requirements call for, that's what makes sense. Similarly, you can keep going further with this, right? We can talk now about multi-region DR plans, like what BlazeClan built for one of their customers, right? In this case, this is significantly more. This is now taking into account what happens if a region goes down, and how do we recover from that? How do we minimize data loss in those cases? Again, the point here is none of these are right or wrong. This is not about telling you you must do it this way or that way. What's important here is that you're working backwards from the customer requirements that you have and then establishing and making architectural choices and trade-offs that make sense within that context. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're designing for resilience, it's not just about the architecture. You can very easily go out and grab a CloudFormation template to go and launch a bunch of resources across multiple AZs and regions. But if you're not thinking about how are you monitoring the application, how do you know when components are healthy or not, how are you deploying it, how are you making sure that you're standardizing that and rolling back in the event of a bad deployment? What are your operational practices? Do you have automation? Do you have runbooks? Do you have those kind of pieces in place? And then are you testing all of that? Are you running game days? Are you training your staff to make sure that they're aware of how all of this stuff works? All of those pieces are super critical as well when it comes to going and building a truly resilient system. So again, kind of talking about what are we looking for? Like I said, this is a much less sort of black and white type of situation compared to some of the other areas that we have. But what we really care about when we're talking to software partners is, have you defined your resilience goals? Do you have objectives defined? Can you tell me what your RTO and RPO are? Have you thought about these things? And then are you implementing architectures that follow from that? Is the architecture that you've designed appropriate for the particular availability and recovery goals that you have? And then, in addition to that, have you actually tested this? You'd be surprised how many people have never actually seen what happens in the event that something goes bad, right? Have you ever gone in and killed an instance unceremoniously and seen what happens? Have you ever gone in and simulated an AZ failure just to see, do all of these configurations work? Do we have all of the right pieces in place in order to recover from this the way that we expect? And then the last piece is making sure that you're communicating all of these kind of assumptions and plans that you've made to your customer. So if you've designed a system that has a 24-hour RTO, that is a choice. That's not something that I'm going to tell you is wrong, but we want to make sure that it's clear to customers that that's what they can expect. So if they have business needs that require better resilience than that, they can make an educated choice about that. So that's ultimately what we really care about. Now, give it back to Jen to talk about from a services perspective.
There's some differences when it comes to the requirement for service partner validation in terms of resilience. Because we talked about that for customers' engagement, each of the applications are different. So for service partners, we would like you to act as that technical advisor role so that you are advising on what is a realistic RTO, RPO goal for your application. And most importantly, we would like to see our service partners proactively incorporate resilience conversation into the ongoing project engagement. And most importantly, clearly laid out the trade-off between the cost and resilience goals, because that's the single most important thing. When designing or advising these targets, having five minutes RTO or 1 minute data loss always sounds good, but customer application may not require it, because the better target in terms of less downtime and less data loss always lead to increased cost and, more importantly, operational complexity to maintain it. Your customers may not be ready to take on that challenges. So the idea is you work with the business owner or the customer application, define what is a business requirement is, and then the customer's capability to handle in terms of when disruptions happen, when this downtimes happen, how can they recover it, and help them operationally to react to those failures. Similarly, for availability, advise customers in terms of the react to operational events in terms of downtime, what should they do, give that operational guidebook as in the step-by-step to recover. All of this stuff, we would like for you to give us customized cases for that. you have seen the example of 2 different customer applications with how their resilience targets are very different. They're both successfully validated by us because we understand that it has to be driven by customer application, and then the reality of the maturity of that application, as well as customers' capability to deal with that increased complexity and cost, of course. So the key thing is really making sure that you have that proactive conversation of the balancing the trade-off between resilience and cost. I'd like to share 3 resources over here. The first one is a white paper Mike was mentioning, the shared resilience model, shared responsibility model for resilience. If you haven't, please check it out. The second one is a AWS well-architected framework, the reliability pillar. There's a lot of good guidance over here. The third thing is you can actually leverage AWS Resilience Hub to test and validate your RTO, RPO goals. It actually do that on the components level for 4 different things: on customer application RTO, RPO, AWS infrastructure RTO, RPO, and then AZ disruptions and AWS region disruptions. So if you haven't scanned that barcode, you can take a look at how to use Resilience Hub to assess resilience. You can get a report and then help you discover the weakness and get back on track to build that resilience application stack for your customers. So the 4th area we'd like to talk about is workload health monitoring. So this is part of the operational excellence pillar of the well-architected framework. Essentially, we like to see partners to be able to define, track, monitor, and analyze workload health so that your customer knows what are their business impact. So most of the time, we find partners are able to define this matrix and then track them and issue alerts. So I'm just going to point out several gaps we see. The first one is to work backwards from customer business goal, because workload health monitoring isn't simply making sure that application is running functionally, operationally, but rather is serving underlying business purpose. So making sure the matrix you're defining, you're working with the customer to collectively decide that is important because it means to the performance of their workload and lead to a business decisions they need to make. Similarly, with the detect anomaly and then issued alerts, not only customer need to understand what they mean from that workload, but also what it means for their business application, for their bottom line revenue. For the validation requirement, we would like to see you, service partners, develop a mechanism that outline your monitoring workflow with customized matrix. And these are from both technical and business perspective. So this means with that active conversation with the customers, also think about what is customers' existing operational process and tooling they're using to making sure what you're proposing, what you're building can be integrated together with customers. So let's say, for example, if you're building a serverless architecture with primary powered by Lambda function. So you can track all the metrics in terms of the function performance, but it will mean very different things if that function is doing data transformation versus serving as authorizer for access to the APIs. So these are the things you need to be very consciously designing and working with customer to say, workload health monitoring means not only the matrix you're collecting, but also what they mean for the actual bottom line of customer business application. Lastly, we would like to see this monitoring is centralized with a logging tool. I mean, of course, a lot of partners decided to use AWS CloudWatch logs, and there's a barcode for you to scan and get set up, get started. You can also leverage third-party tooling or, again, integrate the piece where a customer is already using. An example we want to show here is Schubert Phyllis. And this is where one of their security competency applications where they're demonstrating what are all the workload health monitoring they're doing. So not only they have a dashboard demonstrating different KPIs, status, what's in alert, what's green, what they're tracking, either it's Lambda function or the containers or whatever stuff they're building up for that particular customer use case. They also have the Lambda matrix to understand the workload health in terms of if this amount of errors are showing, if this is execution time, what does that mean for that application? So this way, it's clear they understand the full cycle of the business, and they're demonstrating how they're helping customers deliver that.
Great. So from a software product perspective, similar types of criteria that we're looking for. First of all, make sure that you're defining the metrics and the thresholds that are necessary in order to understand the health of the workloads that you're operating. We also want to see centralized logging, just the way that Jing was talking about in the services context as well. Make sure that you've built that sort of centralized single pane of glass dashboard that you've got available for your operations team so that they're not going across to multiple places in order to try to correlate all of these pieces of information together. Additionally, we want to see that you've actually implemented alerting, that you've got mechanisms in place to make sure that when bad things happen, your team is getting the alerts that they need so they can go and take action. And lastly, have documented response playbooks, right? So for any alert that you're creating, you should have a playbook available so that your ops team knows what to go to do to troubleshoot that. So the last theme that we're going to talk about today is around customer handover and the shared responsibility. So we talked a little bit about the shared responsibility model previously when we were talking about kind of resilience. And what's important to note here is that when we talk about partners, the customer piece of this is actually divided up into two components, right? You as the partner are also involved in taking care of some of those responsibilities that are on the customer side of the shared responsibility model. And that's one of the reasons why you're so valuable. That's a huge piece of what makes our AWS partners so critical for our business is that they take things off of our customers' plates, make it easier for customers to be successful in the cloud. So what's important here is to make sure that you understand and have clearly defined what goes in each one of these boxes. So again, there's question marks here on the slide because I can't tell you exactly what should go in each of those boxes. Depending on what type of product you have or how you organize your services, you may provide fully managed services that's a completely turnkey application to where there's nothing in that top box, right? You're saying, I will take care of everything AWS related for you. So lots of our managed services partners essentially do that. On the other hand, you may just be there to come and sort of build one specific kind of core critical component of an application stack, and then you hand it over to your customer, and your customer is actually the one that's responsible for deploying it into production and managing all of the ongoing operations in the future. So again, the point of this kind of section is less about what specifically are you doing and what are you not doing, and more about how are you making sure that your customers are set up for success, and how are you telling and making clear to your customers what they're on the hook for and what they need to do. So when you're thinking about this, there's kind of three kind of key steps that we typically talk about. First of all, in developing this sort of standard process for doing the handover, so in a consulting kind of context, that's going to be an actual sort of ceremony or meeting where you're potentially handing over these things and having a standard way of doing that. For a software partner, that may just be your documentation or the kind of onboarding experience that may be entirely automated or entirely offline. Additionally, standardizing the way that you're deploying things for customers is really critical here. So the more kind of automation that you can provide and the more standardized assets here make things more consistent and again, sort of improve that understanding from the customer's perspective of what they're on the hook for and make sure that they're getting it done correctly. And then lastly, making sure that you've defined exactly what are those roles and responsibilities and who's on the hook for doing what. So when we look at this from a services partner perspective, what we will be asking you for when you're going through our validation programs is one, show us that you have checklists and standardized ways to go and assess the deployment readiness. Is this ready to go to production? Do you have a standard way of looking at that? You may have customers that have their own sort of methodologies for that you integrate with or use instead of what you've got. Well, we want to see that you have your own sort of approach and methodology there so that you can do this consistently on every engagement that you have with customers. Similarly, having standardized playbooks for what does that handoff look like? Who's responsible? How are we, what are the steps that are necessary in order to make sure that we've cleaned up all of the credentials that we have, that we make sure that the ops team is enabled, that we've gone through and talked to the right folks that are going to take this over and that they understand all of the monitoring that we've put in place, all of the security controls that we've put in place. Who's responsible for doing that? When does that get done? And how does that need to happen? And then, again, the last piece of this is really being intentional about enabling the customer to go on and take this on themselves and making sure that you're setting them up for success going forward. We've got lots of partners out there that can really build great stuff. They can develop software. They can build CloudFormation templates. But if you're just throwing it over to the wall to your customer and you're not sitting down with them and actually helping to make sure that they're going to be successful going forward, that's not what we're looking for from our top-tier partners that we're really going to get behind and recommend. So we've got a link here for an example of an operational readiness review that you can use as kind of a starting point for your own template. Please absolutely take this, steal it, use it. That's what we want. That's what we want you to do. We've also got an example here from one of our other AWS competency partners, Calent. They've got a very extensive set of assets that they've developed over the years that they reuse across all of the different engagements that they have, right? So they've got these sort of customized to the different offerings that they provide to customers, and they can go in and use these assets as part of their customer handoff to make sure that they're going through all of the things each and every time and making sure that every customer that they have is set up to successfully operate this, to operate the solutions that they've built for them. Now turning back over to the software side, again, similar sort of mindset overall, but generally speaking, this is going to manifest itself in terms of documentation. So we want to see in your customer documentation, and sometimes this is public-facing documentation that you can just send us a link to. In other cases, you may actually be sort of putting this into custom contracts. That happens from time to time, depending on the type of business that you're running. It doesn't really matter where the documentation lives. We just want to see that you have sort of a standard way of communicating what is on the customer's side of the shared responsibility model. If you run a database as a service, for instance, who's responsible for backing up the data? Is that something that you're doing, or is that something your customer is doing? How should they do that? Making sure that they understand all of that, right? Also, giving customers guidance for how do they deploy your software in their environment according to well-architected best practices is another really important thing. So if you've got a SaaS product that doesn't require customers to do any deployment, great. Like there's nothing, again, that's one of those examples where there's really nothing on the customer side of the shared responsibility model, so that's easy. But in a lot of cases, software products need to have some components that are actually deployed into the customer's account itself. And so if you're doing that, make sure that you're giving them guidance around, how do you configure security groups correctly for this particular product? What are the ports that need to be open? What are the IAM credentials or IAM policies and actions that you need to provide permissions to in order for this thing to run correctly? And really just in general, try to avoid customer surprises. That's really what we're trying to achieve with all of this. So with that, we really appreciate your time and attention during this. We just want to cover a few more things before we close out. A couple of quick disclaimers. We've talked through a lot of things. We've given you a lot of sort of guidance around technical best practices. But please make sure that you're taking a look at our actual program checklists. So whether you're applying for a competency or service delivery or managed services provider program, take a look at the checklist. That is the ultimate authority on what our criteria are. Please don't come and tell them, oh, I heard Mike say this at reInvent, and so that's why I did it this way. We put a lot of effort into building those checklists and building out the content around them, and they've got a lot of detail and specificity in them. Additionally, this content and our checklists do get updated periodically. We try to really make sure that we're staying on top of this and aligning things and simplifying them as much as we can. So we typically update our checklists twice a year. So you should see another update coming out here sort of towards the end of Q1, and then we typically also do one in kind of the August timeframe, sort of before the big reInvent rush. And lastly, we do hold a high bar here. So you should expect that there's going to be some effort required in order to come in and pass one of our technical validation programs. We're constantly trying to work to make this as low friction as possible. But like Jing said at the very beginning, we're really trying to do this on behalf of our customers. And so we do try to hold a high bar to make sure that everything that we're recommending to them does meet the standards that we know they have. A couple other quick notes about some things that are new. So if you've been in the APN for a while and you've seen a number of these things, we wanted to just call out a couple of quick updates. First of all, the AWS Foundational Technical Review. This has historically been something that we've offered for software products primarily. This year, we also released a version of the FTR for services offerings. So if you're a services partner, you've got a consulting offering or consulting solution that you want to get into Partner Solutions Finder, but you're maybe not ready to go through and do a full competency review, the FTR is a good way that you can go and get that validated. It's a lighter weight, lower bar than what competency requires, and is a good way for you to go and kind of get started on that journey. Additionally, we've also done a lot of work this year to create what we're calling calibration guides. So we've delivered these for a dozen or so of our most popular designations right now, which provide kind of an in-depth, detailed look at each one of the individual controls in each checklist to describe specifically, what does good look like, what are examples of good responses, examples of bad responses, and some additional sort of commentary on what is it that we're looking for, not looking for, to help trying to drive consistency in our validations and help give you guidance that you need to know what to expect when you're preparing an application. So definitely check out any of the calibration guides that are available for the designations you're applying for. And lastly, we hope that you can kind of walk out and get started working towards achieving some of these designations. We've got a number of different programs to offer, starting from the Foundational Technical Review, which, as I mentioned, is kind of the starting point and the lowest bar where you can get started on your journey, all the way through our service validation and competency programs, as well as the AWS Managed Services Provider program if you are an MSP. Take a look at the specific individual program websites. This is where you can find more details about each one of these programs and get links to those checklists that I mentioned. Like we said, first step, take a look at the checklist, get all the details that you need, consult the calibration guides, and that's definitely the best way to get started. So we'd like to thank everyone for your time. We've got one last very quick little activity that I would like. If everyone could pull out your phones, if you could pull that up and open up the AWS Events app, go into the session and give us some feedback right now while you're thinking of it. We really appreciate the feedback that you give us. We read every single comment that we get. We want to know what we can do to make this session better, what it is that we missed or what you liked about it. We really, really do value your feedback, and we appreciate your attention today. Jing and I will be outside the room after this. If anyone has additional questions or wants to talk some more than happy to do so out there. And otherwise, have a good evening.
Thank you.